John Kay of Greens MLC here in New South Wales to speak about green jobs and other related issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I say this is the second meeting I've been to in 2 nights where I've been overwhelmed by the size of the crowd. And it's partly a tribute to all of you who are here tonight, the people who were up in Narrabeen last night, sort of focusing on either end of Sydney at the moment. But it's also a tribute to how dire the situation we're in and how frustrated people are feeling at the lack of action by state and federal governments. So your being here tonight is actually a very important step. Even though we're all probably of a fairly similar mind here tonight, it's a very important step along the road to telling governments that we want a whole lot more to happen. I was asked tonight to talk about the big projects that we need and don't need in New South Wales, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something completely different. What I want to do, it would be fun to do that. We could talk about solar thermal, we could talk about wind, and we could talk about solar photovoltaic and tidal and hot rock geothermal, and I could spend a lot of time talking about the technology. And as a defrocked engineer, or an ex-frocked engineer, I'd probably enjoy doing that, but I don't think you would enjoy it. I don't think we get as much out of it, because it's something we need to discuss more importantly than the technology, and that's the process for driving the change. And to pick up on Frank's analogy, and I hate using green, it's really bad to use a war analogy, but it's a very important analogy. In 1939, the US Army was almost non-existent. In fact, there's a wonderful piece of footage of the US Army on manoeuvres with broomsticks, pointing at each other and going bang, bang. By 1942, they had the world's largest defence force. They went from spending 0.3% of their economy on defence to 30% of their economy on defence in just 2 years. So 29.7% of their economy went from elsewhere into defence in just 2 years. And as Frank pointed out, they didn't do it by some kind of market. They did it by saying we have a danger which if we don't respond to, our standard of life will collapse. So they said we've got to do this. And the got to part of that became very important. They issued directives to General Motors to make tanks. They issued directives to Boeing Aircraft Corporation to make military aircraft. And they actually told people, you've got to do this. They left aside the niceties of a market economy for a while and said, it's time, we're faced with a challenge. If we don't respond to it, it's going to be very bad for us. We have to respond, so this is what we will do. The challenge of climate change is no less present than the danger that was faced in 1941 and 1940 by the United States and by the English-speaking world. We have to respond, and we have to respond in a way that goes beyond the niceties of markets and talks about the things we need to do. I'm going to narrow my scope a little bit. I'm only going to talk about New South Wales because that's what I represent, and I'm only going to talk about the electricity industry. And why the electricity industry? Because it's 57 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. It's 37% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. But it's a very important 37%. It's the 37% of our emissions that makes us the worst greenhouse gas emitters in the world. Actually, it doesn't. It makes us the second worst per capita greenhouse gas emitters in the world. The Victorians are worse than we are. So if you're feeling bad about yourself, just be pleased you're not a Victorian. That's because they burn brown coal. We're bad because 90% of our electricity comes from black coal. There's about, roughly speaking, $15 billion worth of black coal power stations in New South Wales, and another $15 billion worth of poles, maybe about $20 billion worth of poles and wires. And what I'm going to say to you tonight is we have to do something dramatic with that, roughly speaking, $40 billion worth of capital equipment. We have to do some fairly dramatic things, and we have to do it in a hurry. But those 6 power stations that emit that 57 million tonnes of carbon dioxide, we have to reduce that amount. We have one of two choices. Choice number one is we can fix them so as they don't emit that carbon dioxide. Choice number two, the only other alternative, is to start shutting them down. So let's look at the first alternative, and that's the idea that you capture the carbon dioxide and do something with it. You clean them up. That's called clean coal. And the sad, it'd be great if clean coal worked. We could probably all go home right now. The sad reality is that clean coal in commercial scale applications has never been applied anywhere in the world. In fact, in New South Wales, whenever I ask the Minister for using a whole lot more energy, Ian McDonald, whenever I ask him about clean coal, he always goes to a pilot plant. Actually, it's not a pilot plant, it's a test plant to build a pilot plant at Munnamora Power Station. Munnamora Power Station is the smallest coal-fired power station in New South Wales. And this is like when you go fishing and you have to throw it back. Well, this is capture and release. They're capturing and storing it. They actually capture it and they put it back into the atmosphere. I don't know whether it's an animal carbon dioxide cruelty thing or whatever, but that's what they do. They capture less than 0.1% of the carbon dioxide that comes out of New South Wales' smallest coal-fired power station. And that's their progress. So having gotten quite bored with hearing about this wonderful test for a pilot program, which by the way I don't think actually works at the moment, having got quite bored with that, I probably woke up one day and said, hey, this is bad. Minister for using a whole lot more energy, what is your plan B? If the clean coal, the carbon capture and storage, doesn't work in the time scale that we need it to work in to be participants in the global effort to stop the Antarctic disappearing, what are you going to do if it doesn't work? What's your plan B? And his response was very illuminating. It came in two parts. The first part was to say, well, we don't need a plan B because it's going to work. And the second part was to sit down and pull up a book and start reading a book, which is a very rude thing to do during question time, but it was a very special book. It was called Between Heaven and Earth, and it was written by Ian Plimer. It was the Bible of climate denial. So that's where we're at with clean coal. Basically, that leaves us with only one choice, and that is somebody, if we're really going to become global citizens, responsible global citizens, somebody needs to go down to Officeworks and buy some yellow sticky notes and a thick pen. And they've got to write used by dates and go around to each of the 6 coal-fired power stations in New South Wales and stick used by dates on them. And create a trajectory, probably over the next 20 years, so that by about 2029, 2030, we're no longer burning coal in the state. Now, it sounds like a hard order, it sounds like a hard drive to do, but if we don't do that, if we keep talking about emissions trading and a little program here and a pilot project there and something else there, we will reach 2025, 2020, and two things will happen. Firstly, the world will be in an appalling state, and secondly, the world will turn around to Australia, and particularly to New South Wales, and say, listen, we don't want your coal anymore, and you can't burn it, and you've got to stop doing it. And we will be in the crisis from central casting. We will hit the wall economically at a time when the planet is hitting the wall environmentally. It's an irresponsible action, economically and socially, to not begin closing down coal-fired power stations right now. Now you think, well, does that mean, as Piers Ackerman would say, we have to live in caves and eat moss? Not that there's anything wrong with living in caves and eating moss, but it doesn't mean that. And let me just tell you how we're going to do this, because it's not that hard to do. There are two ways of closing down power stations. The first way is to reduce the amount of energy we use, and the second is to build replacements. Let's go to the reduction side first. On the reduction side, there are two very easy targets. The first one is the aluminium smelters. If we shut down the 2 aluminium smelters, multinational, foreign-owned aluminium smelters in New South Wales, we would actually go 20% of the way towards what we need to do. So that'd be a good starting place. We'll come back to why that's an economically sound thing to do in a minute. Once we've done that, we can then start rapidly phasing out all those electric off-peak hot waters, much more rapidly than we currently are, replacing them with solar. That'll get us another 10% of the way. And on top of that, we can find about another 10 to 20% of more further energy efficiency measures, doing things in the home more efficiently. The Institute for Sustainable Futures at UTS published a report last week or was it this week? I can't remember. We've said basically there's about 20% of efficiency gains we can make. We're 50% of the way there, and guess what? We haven't wasted a dollar. We're actually better off if we make those transitions. We will actually, as an economy, some people will be paying more, other people will be paying less, there'll be winners and losers, but as a total economy, we'll actually be better off if we do that. We'll spend less money on coal-fired power stations, we'll have more money for public schools, public hospitals, public transport. So it's a good thing to do. But how do we do that? How do we make those transitions? Well, the New South Wales, remember I said that's a 50% change in our energy patterns. New South Wales government has just set up, believe it or not, an energy efficiency trading market in New South Wales. Very proudly announced with lots of trumpets and fanfare and all those things you do when you're a Minister of the Crown. And that's going to save us, wait for it, 4% by 2020. If it saves us anything at all, because there are some very dodgy aspects of the scheme. So the last thing you want to do is set up a dodgy trading market to do this. What you do, as Frank said, is you say, okay, we're going to prohibit certain activities. Just as we prohibit certain activities by your neighbours that would annoy you, we're going to prohibit certain activities by people who will annoy the climate. We're going to prohibit the smelting of aluminium. We're going to prohibit the construction of more energy-intensive industries. We're going to prohibit the sale of energy-inefficient appliances. It's a little bit heavy-handed, but the alternative is that we end up with all sorts of major economic and environmental problems. It's all doable. What about the other 50%? Well, the other 50% means we have to look at a whole lot of technologies that, some of which we actually invented right here in New South Wales at Sydney University. Solar thermal electricity being built now in California, being built in Spain. We capture the heat from the sun, you concentrate it in tubes, you boil water, you pass it through a power station. We know how to do it in relatively small increments. We've successfully done it up to 50 megawatts. We need to scale that up by a factor of 10, and we need to do that in a hurry. Now, waiting around for the market to drive that scaling up won't happen. If we do that, it won't happen in a time scale. Probably take us 10, maybe 15 years to do it. And we need to be moving more rapidly than that. So what that means is it's time for the New South Wales government to do something so radical that it was what every state government did about 60 to 70 years ago, which is to make direct investments in particular technologies. At the end of the Second World War, people came back from the war and they wanted stuff. They wanted lots of stuff, and we had to manufacture that stuff for them. Manufacturing stuff in those days meant a lot of energy, and we didn't have enough energy. And the economy rattled and shook and looked like it was going to fall over, and the state governments intervened. They said, okay, we're going to build lots of power stations. We're going to borrow the money, you're going to pay it back in your electricity bills, you're going to do it over a 30-year period, and it was a key ingredient in kick-starting a major boom. They did it because they knew in the timescales available, the private sector would not do it. Sound familiar? It's exactly the problem we've got today with exactly the same solution. It's time for governments to give up on the neoliberal agenda, the greed is good agenda, and say governments have a role in the economy, they need to borrow, they need to build. Yes, there's some risk in going rapidly into this technology, but that's a risk that governments can afford to take because we all share that risk. There's an even greater risk of not going into that technology. There's a greater risk of technological isolation. And if we end up in that isolated situation, we're going to lose lots of jobs. So let's talk about jobs, because what I've described to you is a major shift in our economy. And you might think, well, who on earth would put the Greens in charge of an economy? No offence to Frank, he's sort of a different kind of Green. But who would put the Greens in charge of the economy? I mean, aren't we going to wreck it? You're going to shut down our coal industry, you're going to shut down our power stations. Oh, power stations alone. You're going to wreck all those jobs in the power stations and the coal mines that feed them. Well, let's talk some numbers here. Those power stations employ 1,000 people. The coal mines that feed those power stations add direct and indirect jobs, about 6,000 people. So a total of about 7,000 jobs in the coal mines and in the power stations that keep the lights on in New South Wales. A University of Newcastle study from last year said if New South Wales made the transition to an energy efficiency, renewable energy future, and we manufactured a lot of the stuff here in New South Wales, we would generate 73,800 new jobs. So we shut down an industry that currently employs 7,000 people. We start up a new industry that employs 73,800 jobs. We grow the job market by a factor of 10. And we can do that, a lot of that we can do in areas of high unemployment, particularly in the Illawarra, where we have a disgracefully high level of youth unemployment and underemployment. In the Hunter, where there is now a growing unemployment problem because of the collapse of a traditional and possibly outdated manufacturing base. And in rural and regional centres around New South Wales, where growing populations aren't able to generate enough jobs. We can actually throw New South Wales into a Greens energy boost, into a Greens energy boom. I said shut down the aluminium smelters. Now, there's been a lot of debate about aluminium smelters, and there are two arguments that come back at you whenever you say we should shut down the aluminium smelters. The first one is, well, if you shut down Australia's aluminium smelters and they go overseas, well, hey, isn't that going to be worse? Because, like, overseas, can't drink the water, get sick, electricity more dirty, really bad. Not true. If you take a globe, and the aluminium we smelt in New South Wales, for every tonne of aluminium we produce, we create 13.6 tonnes of carbon dioxide. About 90% of that is in power stations, because as Bob Carr, a wonderful man, once said, aluminium is basically bottled electricity. When you export aluminium, you're exporting electricity. Our electricity mostly comes out of power stations. So about 90% of the emissions in an aluminium smelter is coming out of coal-fired power stations. If you're Dr. Dolittle and you get your globe and you spin the globe and you stick the pin in the globe, chances are, and you move the aluminium smelters, the two of them, from New South Wales to wherever that pin lands, chances are you'll halve the greenhouse gas emissions. Because the chances are that the electricity will be about half as greenhouse intensive as it is here in New South Wales. If you get lucky and the pin lands in Latin America or in South America where there's an excess of hydro generation, you will actually end up reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per tonne of aluminium smelted by a factor of 20. You're down around a half a tonne of carbon dioxide. So the argument about greenhouse is rubbish. This is the second worst place in the world to be smelting aluminium. The worst place is Victoria. Sorry, mate. I'm actually Victorian, so I can say this.
Growing rice.
What about the jobs, you say? Well, let's look at the jobs. There are 1,500 jobs here in New South Wales in aluminium smelters. Two smelters, Curry and Tomago. And in order to protect those jobs, the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme that we've heard so much about tonight is going to hand over to those aluminium smelters 95% of their emissions in free permits. Basically, we're giving them free, here Mr. Hydro and Camelco, here, have these free permits to cover your costs. What's that saying? By my calculations, at a $30 a tonne cost, giving those two smelters $300 million a year in free permits. It's a bit of arithmetic. $300 million a year divided by 1,500 workers is $200,000 a job each year. So we're paying them, you and I, out of our electricity bills, will be paying the aluminium industry, the multinationals, to employ people $200,000 a year to do some of the most polluting work there is in the world. I've got an idea. Why don't we not do that? Why don't we take that $200,000 instead and put it into building, a bit of it into building factories to build solar reflectors for the solar thermal power stations, or blades for the wind turbines, or towers for the wind turbines, or any of the other multitude of gear that we're going to need and which we don't want to import, we want to build here to capture the jobs here. Why don't we pay those workers $150,000 a year while they retrain, put the rest of the money into building those factories. In 2 years' time, we turn them loose, and away they go, and they're part of the new green economy. The difference is, the big trick there is, when we shut things down in the past, what we've said to the workers involved is, oh, sorry, too bad, you work in the industry we don't need anymore, too bad. In the middle of the 1980s, Keating and Hawke decided they wanted to drop the tariffs on clothing, textile and footwear. 33,000 migrant, mostly people of non-English speaking background, mostly female workers from rural and regional areas and from Western New South Wales, Western Sydney and Western Melbourne, went out of a job. Their structural readjustment package, by my calculation, was worth about $10 each. Not $200,000, but a one-off payment of $10 each. Many of those people disappeared from the workforce forever and were never seen again, dumped onto the industrial scrap heap. That's the wrong way to do a restructuring. What we're saying is let's get it right in the energy area. Let's use the fact that we're generating more jobs by making that transition, taking the workers out of the power stations and into the things which save the planet. And along the way, we generate a whole lot more jobs, we make a whole lot more money, and we build the base for an export industry that can replace our coal exports in the long run. It's a tall order, and we've got a long way to go. We've got a long way to go, not because of you, because you're here tonight, you're really interested in this, you really want to do something. We've got a long way to go because the politicians that lead us are largely without any sense of imagination whatsoever. They remind me of my one-year-old nephew. Unless it's physically in front of them, it really doesn't exist. And the problem is that this requires seeing something that isn't quite here yet and moving us to it. We have a vision deficit in politics in Australia. All they can see is the coal industry. All they can see is the banks. All they can see is the mining industry. All they can see is the development industry. Those are the things that have worked for them in the past: the finance sector, the minerals sector, the real estate sector. Those are the things that have worked in the past. Any future solution to our economy has to be some combination of those three. I want to finish on this one note. If we want to break away from those three, from the trilogy, the unholy trinity of Australia's economy, and we want to move to an economy that is based on the things which will work for the planet, the things which will work for the people, the things which will work for our community, we have to demand it. We cannot wait for politicians to give you that leadership. That leadership is happening in Australia now, and I want to pay tribute to the climate action groups around Australia. The one group of people, I have to say the Australia Institute as well, the two groups of people, the Australia Institute and the climate action groups, that stood up early on and said there's something badly wrong with a climate pollution reduction scheme that does not reduce climate pollution. In fact, all it is a scheme and nothing much else. And they stood up and said that earlier on. They showed the vision. It's time for us to take that vision from not just criticising the climate pollution reduction scheme, the carbon pollution reduction scheme, but to take it somewhere else, and take it to a vision for a new Australia, an Australia based on what we can do collectively for the common good, what we can do collectively for the environment, what we can do collectively for the community. I genuinely believe it's possible. I genuinely believe that if we keep going the way we're going with the climate action groups, we'll get there. Thank you very much indeed.